Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone who is joining us for today's session entitled How 5G and an Immersive Metaverse Will Help Close the Digital Divide in Education. My name is Ted Brown, and I'm honored to introduce you to our group of panelists. First, we have David Christopher, Executive Vice President and General Manager of Partnerships and 5G Ecosystem Development at AT&T. Also with us is Chris Riddell, Human Futurist, Forensic Optimist, and Emerging Catalyst. And last but certainly not least is Ariam Mogos, Emerging Tech Lead at Sanford D School. This session is in partnership with AT&T and will feature a timely discussion around how the metaverse is changing education. Obviously, the last 18 months have deeply impacted our education infrastructure, how students learn from K through 12 all the way through university and graduate education. Technology has transformed that, but the gains have not been evenly distributed. Obviously, certain places have seen how we can embrace things like 5G, how we can embrace things like the metaverse to bring education to a wider swath of the population, but we have a long way to go. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation today, talking about how technology like 5G can bring about this change in how we educate our young people, how we educate people generally around the globe, not just limited to around the corner. So really excited to be here. I want to start with a question for all the panelists because I think we're talking about education today. We all have our favorite moments from school growing up, whether it's a favorite teacher in middle school, whether it's someone in university who really sort of showed you the light as far as your chosen path or your chosen career. So David, let's start with you. Let's hear about sort of the one moment in your educational life that really sort of showed you the way forward for what you wanted to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'll share a story that has a 20-year interspersion in it, and it's when I was really good at algebra. I was terrible at geometry. I was a very visual learner, and I've certainly heard that from many. When my oldest took geometry, Khan Khan Academy was just getting going, and it was literally night and day with how she learned geometry versus how I struggled through it. I learned it in a 2D textbook only modality, and I really struggled. I watched her learn it via Khan Academy tutorials and via much more interesting educational techniques. And it's just, I think, exemplary of early phases of the journey that we're going to talk about here today.
Arian, what about you? I mean, being at Stanford, it must be sort of this fascinating journey, both seeing people being educated day to day and obviously your own educational journey. What's a moment that really crystallized that journey for you?
I think some of my earliest moments in education, I was a huge Sesame Street fan. I loved Big Bird and Oscar the Grouch, and being able to acquire literacy skills and numeracy skills through educational media, through these interesting narratives, through characters that were so lovable, is probably how I really fell in love with learning. So that I would say those are probably my earliest moments when I think about it.
I share those roots in Sesame Street with you, so I identify with that very much. Now, Chris, your expertise is very wide, and your interests sort of are very heterodox. I want to hear about your educational journey. Were there any moments that you really felt sort of compelled you down this path?
Look, when David was talking about algebra, I mean, immediately took me back to some of the worst parts of my childhood growing up at school. I was horrific at maths. The thing that first comes to mind for me is I remember technology back then was this really weird, funny, crazy thing. And I remember the first Macs that we had in our school, I was obsessed with them. And I can remember there was only 3 kids in the entire school that were interested in computers, and I was one of them. And it wasn't very cool back then to be interested in computers at all. And it was a boarding school in the middle of the English countryside, and it was so many cliches that we haven't got time to go into today. But I remember technology back then, I was obsessed with it. So obsessed, by the way. Fast forward a few years into my early teens, and I actually got called into the headmaster's office for bringing the whole network down and hacking into the network there. And that really crystallized my childhood. And I was banned from using computers for a while. And then fast forward a couple of years later, that's where my career really went in a proper direction.
some productive trouble, and it feels like a lot
Totally.
of people
Absolutely.
who are sort of get into technology that later in life have that formative experience where they were tinkering around and really figuring out, what makes these things tick.
Absolutely.
Chris, I want to start with you because I think that when the word metaverse comes up, it brings up a lot of fuzzy images, and I think that there's a lot of maybe misconceptions, maybe sort of misdirection around what exactly the metaverse is. I'm wondering if you can shed some light on sort of giving us a common definition of it.
Look, the metaverse is a combination of a number of different things. And the first thing is worth saying is we are really early doors with this at the moment. It's this fusion of games, it's a fusion of augmented reality, mixed reality, virtual reality. But here's the big difference it isn't just those together. This is a completely new social environment for us to be able to live in and jump out of this crazy world that we're in at the moment. And if you look at organizations like Facebook, I mean, Mark Zuckerberg in one of their last investor earning calls turned around and said that they are moving away from being a social media company to a metaverse company. And he warned all the investors that this is going to be really, really expensive. And they're already spending hundreds of billions of dollars on this every year. And if you look at some of the interesting people that are involved in this from the Facebook side, I mean, they absolutely see this as their future. You've got one of the ex-heads of product from Instagram that's moving over into this space. This is big. They're betting big on this. And so they should be, because this is, as they say, one of the biggest leaps that we've ever had since the days of the mobile internet. So this fusion of 5G and learning and metaverse is where we are going into some extraordinary times. And I think the big thing for us now is that we look in a post-pandemic, or so we're not post-pandemic, but a midway pandemic world that we're in, is that I think we've lost a lot of the fear around technology and artificial intelligence and robotics. So this era that we're in now, I think we're lining ourselves up to be in a really extraordinary place to actually be able to cope with this from a humanity perspective as well as from a technology perspective. But the thing is, this is early days.
David, you had an interesting perspective on this that I wanted to hear about. Sort of this is not a finished project, right? This is sort of the internet as a general concept is never finished, but the metaverse is sort of an offshoot of that. Is also sort of it goes on similar rails. And can you tell me a little bit about that perspective?
Yeah, Ted. I think the way I think about it is the metaverse is not one thing, first of all, and two is it's decade or decades out. But the journey that we're on to the metaverse is what's so interesting, right? It's going to take us through AR and VR and mixed reality, so virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, etc., and advanced versions of all of those things. And so along that journey, we're going to have deeper and deeper immersion into virtual simulated worlds that we are within. We are not just looking upon, but we are within them. And to Chris's point, that's becoming more normal, more commonplace. It doesn't have the stigma that it probably once had, and it's something that generations are becoming very used to that. And so the learning opportunities within that journey are just tremendous. You cannot imagine the understanding and the conceptualization that these tools provide compared to what we had in a 2D textbook world. And so that's why it's such a fascinating time for us.
And Aaron, I wanted to hear your perspective because your work is really where the rubber hits the road with a lot of these things. And I wanted to hear what you think of how the metaverse is influencing education on the ground and sort of how it's influencing how students learn, how they engage in the classroom.
I think the metaverse hasn't had a huge influence on all of our, within our school system just yet in the United States. But I do think that there is a lot of potential, as Chris and David said, the immersive nature of all of these technologies and the potential for education, especially for students who aren't necessarily engaged in school in many different ways, is huge. I think where I think we have to be careful, or where we have to be cautious, is thinking about the role of educators and education administrators. Uh, the metaverse being composed of many different technologies and tools, that means that to create a really effective, engaging learning experience, educators have to be versed in these technologies and understand how to design with them. And that's not a skill many educators have. So for the metaverse to actualize in education, what does that mean in terms of the skills and the resources that our teachers and educators and administrators need? Not just sort of financial resources, but the professional development and the skills and the mindsets to design these environments for their students.
Chris, I see you nodding your head, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this because, as a futurist, I mean, some of thinking about the future is how we equip people to deal with the future. And educators are obviously a massive part of that. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on how we prepare educators, administrators to deal with emerging technologies like this.
Do you know, that's a good question, Ted. We were chatting about that just before we came on air here. And as a futurist, as a dad, I think one of the things that I've recognized in this pandemic more than ever is just how technology isn't enough a part of, certainly even in this part of the world, in Australia, in Melbourne, where we're sat here today, technology isn't a part of enough our learning environments anywhere near what it should be. And the so what for that is the teachers. I mean, look at what they've had to do in shifting in many parts of the world, and particularly here in Australia, to these virtual learning environments. They've had to become technology experts overnight. And I take my hat off to them. Teachers are not even close to being paid enough for what they've done in the last 18 months around the world. These are extraordinary individuals. And if we really want to embrace the true power of the metaverse and what this opportunity really is, then we're going to have to do better in making sure that the teachers are equipped to deal with this, and our schools around the world are, because there's this massive gap at the moment. And I think that's really between education and the real rest of the world when it comes to technology. And I think the pandemic, in every good reason, has exposed that. And I think one of the things we've learned is we need to step the game up. And I think we're going to. I mean, the fundamental thing is we're not going to go back to the world it was in a post-pandemic normal, for want of a better word. I think we've got to use this as an opportunity to go, you know what? We've now set a base normal. We've now set this base level. Where do we want to go to from here? We do have a bit of time. We're early days with the metaverse, but this is a much broader conversation as well around how we're equipping our children, our teachers, right from day one with the right technology. And I think we're at the best place we've ever been in humanity to do that now.
Yeah, and Ted, could I jump in there? I think it's really interesting. Back to Arian, what Arian was saying is instructional strategy is so important here. What are the use cases where this technology can be applied? What is the strategy for the pedagogy, right, if you will? There's certain things like experiential learning, where the journey of AR and VR and eventually the metaverse is really applicable. If you're studying anatomy and you're using AR or VR to look at the body, I understand where the spleen is versus where the liver is. I understand how this is put together. I can spin it around. I can see it 3D. That's an amazing capability. And that's, again, early days. We're seeing those use cases today. If you're an engineering student, if you're looking at, if you're an architectural student, I mean, those things are amazing. And those are use cases where it really, really works. There are going to be other use cases where it doesn't really fit the use case. And that's where I think we've got to be really smart to apply it in true value add ways.
And I just want to add to what David said. I think what is so exciting about the metaverse and the way all these different technologies can be used is it can push us far, in the direction of more project-based, problem-based, experiential learning, and away from rote learning, which is honestly right now still sort of the main pedagogy across the world, right? So in some ways, the emergence of these types of technologies and the experiences that you can create with them, with the right instructional guidance, can help us move away from rote learning.
Absolutely. I mean, Ariam, do you see immersive learning as a way for developing countries, sort of countries that have not seen the benefits of 5G, these next generation technologies? Do you see immersive learning as a way for a skills gap and education gap to be bridged?
Yeah, I think for certain countries, I think where, for example, the schools are very under-equipped. They don't have science labs. I think advances and where equipment and science labs can be very costly in countries like India or Ethiopia. I think that emerging technologies and connectivity, as it becomes more affordable, can be a viable, quick, and really effective alternative to sort of brick and mortar solutions. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there, and we're actually seeing a lot more of those types of AR and VR solutions in countries like India.
David, I wanted to ask about AT&T's relationship with education because obviously AT&T has invested a lot of in educational infrastructure, and Ariam's talking about sort of what this connected tissue looks like for a lot of opportunities. What can you tell us about sort of what AT&T is working on now as far as investment in next generation immersive education looks like?
Yeah, yeah, no, totally. Thanks for the question. It's well, first of all, first and foremost, we as a society have to close the digital divide. We have to solve the access problem so that we can get the solutions that Ariam is talking about in front of students that need it most. And so we're deeply committed to that at AT&T. We're deeply committed to that as a country with President Biden and the White House. And so first and foremost, we've got to do that. We have a long history of aligning ourselves with furthering education. Over the last decade plus, we've invested probably close to $600 million in educational initiatives. Coupled with that, obviously, we create networks, and we've invested well over $100 billion in our network over the last 5+ years. And so those two things are critical, not only to make our company more competitive, but much more importantly, in the context of this talk today, is make our country more competitive. And to do that, we have got to make education the bulwark, the foundation of what we focus on as a society, as a country. And so we think that those two things come together very nicely, creating networks that are ubiquitous, providing broad access, and coupling that with the educational promise that we're talking about here today. So it's deeply important to us.
And Chris, I want to hear your global perspective on that because obviously you keep tabs on how people are developing these different networks around the world, how you see the development in this technology looking like in different regions, and how it sort of moves from place to place, how it looks different from place to place.
I think this is where we get into an interesting pointy end of the conversation, particularly when we look at fundamentally now in the world, we have two technology stacks. We've got one in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley. You've got another one coming out of the east in Shenzhen in China. And if we look at from the China side of things, I mean, arguably a lot of that stuff's happening quicker and has the potential to be a lot more disruptive than some of the tech that we've seen coming out of the United States. The thing that is really, for me, quite interesting is the rules by which we play. When we look at things like regulation and the way that we use data and information, the rules that we see coming out of the East are very, very different to the ones that we play by. And for us to continue to remain competitive when we're looking at, say, the United States, which we're talking around here now, that is a big challenge because we have to pick up the game. This is the biggest opportunity that we've seen, without doubt. But the question we've got to ask ourselves is, again, what are the rules that we're playing to, and what are the platforms looking like to be able to do that?
Absolutely. Ariam, I wanted to ask a sort of a different question. I know that the last 18 months, I mean, it started, the transformation in education we've had to deal with over the last 18 months was brought about by something disruptive and not planned for. Your role, say for D School, I mean, you're looking at how these systems might look like in the future when they're built with a purpose and they're built deliberately and not sort of as something that's taken us by surprise. What does that ideal state look like, and how does immersive education, how does the metaverse play into that ideal future state?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think in a couple of ways. I mean, I think broader access means that students of different backgrounds who have traditionally been marginalized or not had access have access. I think that's a future that we're looking to and hoping to build. I think students who have not been engaged within the formal school system are have opportunities to be engaged differently and have opportunities, period. I think it means that young people and educators have an opportunity to imagine and design in really speculative ways about the future of education, the future of their communities, um, and in really creative ways with really interesting tools. So I think just engagement overall can really change with the metaverse. I think if I had to boil it down to that, I think it's just a different type of engagement that can be deeper and more authentic, especially when that guidance piece is there.
I love that speculative design. This ability to play, I think, is a really interesting way of looking at this. And Chris, I wanted your perspective on that because I think that this is probably something you spent a lot of time thinking about, what this speculative future looks like. What does it look like?
I think for us, again, if we're looking at the metaverse here, it's around creating ways to have experiences that we can't do in the world that we're in today. And it's like so many other technologies, it's an augmentation, it's not a replacement, right? I mean, this is where fear fundamentally comes from, because as humans, we hate change. The fear is that something is being replaced and taken away, and we're not going to have that anymore. And there's so many examples of that through history where people fundamentally fear that. And if we look at where the opportunities sit, even beyond education, this is the biggest opportunities that brands, organizations have ever had in history to create really meaningful engagement with the people that they actually want to reach. And that's phenomenal. Creating experiences that we've never been able to have, to be able to have limitless ways to do that. This is where this really gets interesting.
I just wanted to add to what Chris said. I think what's also really powerful is using these tools as a way to reimagine the environments in which we currently live, in which we may not be very satisfied. And that can be a tool for empowerment, especially for young people.
Absolutely.
And I think that's really important because we don't necessarily, especially in high stakes situations, we don't have those opportunities to take risks. And these type of tools within the metaverse can provide us with the opportunity to take risks, even when we aren't necessarily able to.
I love that point, absolutely, and this opens up a whole new frontier for people that simply wouldn't have been able to have anything near to this type of experiences, or that were fearing anything going wrong, and to be able to create and reinvent and define that new world. That's where the bit for me gets really interesting. It's that humanity component. This isn't a tech thing. This is about humanity and making the world into a better place, which sounds like a really lofty dream, but when you look at the opportunities that what things like the metaverse do, that's why we see Facebook going so hard into this. That's why we see so much investment. This is the biggest thing we have seen, arguably, since the dawn of mobile internet or the internet itself. This is extraordinary because it brings a whole world together in an entirely different way.
I agree with you. I agree with what's been said here. I think, though, bringing it back to education, though, for a second, what's so exciting is, to Ariam's point, the physical brick and mortar world in some ways doesn't apply nearly as much for learning, right? I mean, the ability to really understand experientially how chemistry works, you don't need to have the very expensive lab anymore if you've got connectivity and you've got, again, the way to immerse yourself in the world we're talking about, the metaverse version of the chemistry classroom. And that's what's so incredibly exciting. The experiential is going to be so much more attainable, and so if you have the right curriculum strategy, it really becomes, the sky's the limit here. So it's a brave new era.
And David, I actually wanted to loop back to sort of our opening question and ask you about how something like the metaverse would have changed your relationship with education growing up. Obviously, we're in early days, as we talked about. It's sort of a journey that's ongoing. But I'd love to hear your perspective on that. I think it's sort of funny to think about what these retro histories might look like if we had the access to the technology we might have in 10 years, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's transformational in almost every respect, but specifically ones that are, again, we keep using the word experiential, but imagine if you're interested in marine biology, the ability to be and swim in and be immersed in an undersea environment. The same thing is true whether you're studying the solar system and you're looking at planetary environments. Anything that is so that just opens up an entirely new world where I think the ability to learn and learn differently is so dramatically changed. And then anything that requires doing, like imagine you're a residency in medical school, or you're a doctor. Frankly, the ability to train and have advanced training is a function of where you are today. In a teaching hospital, it's fundamentally different than in a remote hospital. In a metaverse world, you can train with and be a part of and do surgical procedures over and over again to get it right and to be an expert in a world of the metaverse. And it fundamentally changes the notion of equality in terms of education and experience that's just transformational for our society. And that's what I think why it's such a big idea, and one that we're so excited about.
It brings up a really interesting point about access to resources. And Ariam and Chris, I want both your perspective on this. Whether it's something like a vocational education, you're learning how to be a car mechanic, or professional education, learning how to be an architect, having hands-on access is such a gate for a lot of people, and the ability to access these things and access the high quality tools, high quality platforms, all that sort of thing. Do you see the metaverse, do you see 5G as a way of flattening that a little bit and sort of creating equal access to a lot of these platforms that maybe are physically restrained? You have to go to a place to actually access them, or resource constrained where you can only access them in places that have a lot of money to spend on education. Ariam, I'd love your perspective first, and then Chris, I'd love yours as well.
Yeah, I think that's very, very possible. I think that being able to acquire skills and training in a way which is much more accessible, whether that's because maybe you live in a rural area and you don't have opportunities near you and it's far to travel, whether there's economic reasons you don't have access to opportunities, whether there's institutional barriers. I think there's a number of reasons why the metaverse can provide opportunities that do level the playing field, and it can be more equitable. I don't know about the use cases just yet, but I think yes, I think that's very, very possible.
I think this is a really interesting conversation, or part of the conversation, Ted, because if I look at where I am here in Australia, Australians hug the coastline. I think almost 90%, it's some stupid statistic, so I'm sure somebody will find the real one, but something like 90% of our population hugs the coastline, and the rest of Australia is pretty spread out, and heaps of it is uninhabitable. So that comes to a real challenge when you look at infrastructure. So the incumbent, the national telco, for want of a better word here, Telstra in Australia, has really been under pressure from day one, since the advent of the internet, to get internet connectivity out across the country. So even if you've been in a metro area, you can suddenly be just a kilometer or two outside of the city and have woeful internet over here. So what happened was we had the introduction of the national broadband network, and there were some bumps in that, but then 5G came along. And this was, I remember prophesizing about this before 5G landed here. 5G was one of the things that I knew was going to absolutely be a big challenger for the infrastructure way of thinking and doing things, particularly when you come to residential, less so for commercial, but more so for residential purposes. This has been true. I mean, the 5G speeds we get here in Australia, it's nothing unusual to have upwards of 800 megabits a second across the telco, so not just with Telstra, but with the others as well. And that's kind of become a normal. We've just accepted that that's normal now here. And that was ground zero. We've had the introduction of the new iPhone. It's got new 5G technology in again, which elevates that to yet another layer. And this is now the ground zero that we're talking about today. So if we look at when we're trying to adopt these new ways of doing things with really bandwidth intensive platforms like the Metaverse, we have to have this mobile infrastructure out there. We need this to be able to make this really work. And it isn't just the Metaverse. It's so many other different types of technologies. And if we truly want to get out access around the world and make this equitable, then this is how we have to see this new era. It is mobile-led. It's mobile-driven. It's not to say that our ground infrastructure is going to disappear. Far from it. We used to live in a pre-pandemic world in Huntington Beach in California, and it blew me away, the speeds you could get there just 18 months ago with a cable into the house. But mobile is advancing at a rate of knots. The way that they can compress data down to go across our mobile networks, that's where we'll see this explosion in the way that we adopt mobile, high-intensity, high-bandwidth technology platforms like the Metaverse.
And David, I obviously love your thoughts on that. Given AT&T's development of 5G infrastructure, I mean, there's such a promise of this rural connectivity, as Chris was talking about, this idea that we can give equal or at least as good access to people who are living outside of major cities to do things like engage in the metaverse for education, to do things like immersive education, even when the direct access to those facilities might not be there for them.
Yeah, look, I think the promise of ubiquitous networks is what we're all working towards, and it's so fundamental to the case we're making here today that education can be transformed as we go down the journey here, and it's absolutely true. The reality of it is we need high-speed networks. That's what we work on every day, but we also need interoperability across multiple ecosystems here, and to deliver the metaverse, it's across compute, it's across rendering, it's across security, it's across different areas of persistence, it's across permissions. It's touching so many different ecosystems and platforms, and having an economy that and the drive for openness and interoperability is fundamental here to realize the vision that we're talking about. And so it's again big part of all of our focus here today.
Absolutely. As we come to the close of this panel, this has been a great conversation. I want to give everyone the opportunity to sort of get out the crystal ball. And I know that, Chris, you kind of sort of do this for a living, so I want to start with you and talk about what the future of EdTech holds and how we as a society, we as communities can help usher in that more purpose-built future of education and technology.
I think the truth is now the world has moved so fast, and what the pandemic has proved is the acceleration of how we have are able to adopt technology. One of the things that I talk most about at events is in the last 2 years is if this pandemic had have happened just 5 years ago, this would have been a vastly different story. And if you look at learning as well, as a dad and looking at how my little girl has her virtual classrooms with her teachers, I dread to think what that would have looked like just 5-6 years ago. It would have been a completely different story. And I think going forwards, what we recognize as humanity is the incredible power that technology can genuinely bring us. And we've gone round a turning point. I'll give you an example. I mean, one of the things I talk about the most at the moment is that every briefing call I would have had with a client pre an event I would speak at for the last 10 years, they would always talk about, could you please address the fear of robotics and artificial intelligence and automation? Are we going to have war in the streets? Is it going to be all-out war? And I promise you, I kid you not, since the pandemic started, I've not had that conversation once with a single client. We've gone round a corner. We've had a turning point. We've truly seen the amazing opportunities and possibilities that technology like this can bring. And I think we've got to capitalize on that. We've got a window now where people around the world are expecting to see the really great stuff that we can do with technology because they've seen how it saved us through the pandemic. We've got to drive in and dial in on that. We've got to really move quickly. We've got to equip our educators. We've got to equip our kids around the world. And this is the best time. This is the most significant moment in history we've ever had to do that. And we can't afford to miss this moment. And this is a moment in history. And if we set this platform right now, we'll define the next 100 years of society in a way that we've never ever seen before.
Arim, I want to give you the opportunity to speak next because you're immersed in this every day. And I want to hear what you think is coming down the pipeline the next decade when it comes to the intersection of education and technology.
I think that technology is just going to become much more central to the way in which we learn. And I think that educators are going to embrace it in ways that maybe today some don't or are unsure of how to. I think 10 years from now, I imagine a world in which many educators are very experienced learning designers with technology, and they're using different types of technologies in which their students are able to express themselves with tech and create with tech and be really imaginative with tech. I mean, that's what I hope to see in the next 10 years. And in particular, we really move away from models of rote learning and pedagogy at scale. So just seeing countries across the world really move away from the rote learning, in their education system, and hopefully technology will support that.
David, I want to give you the last word here. The future of education technology. What is happening at that intersection in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I think the ability to transform how education is done and how learning takes place is the opportunity. And I think that is what's going to happen. Having ubiquitous networks, changing the quality of access to those networks by closing the digital divide, providing access to high-speed networks for future educational capabilities is what we're striving for. And it's a massive opportunity. If you think about a continuum of the journey we talked about, providing new ways of learning, new instructional strategies for both teachers and learners, it's such an exciting time. And I do think it will completely reinvent how students learn and grow. It couldn't be more exciting. It really couldn't be.
Well, I'm looking forward to reconvening this panel in 10 years, maybe in the Metaverse. That's all the time we have for today. I want to thank our lovely panelists, David Christopher, Chris Riddell, and Aria Mogos for joining us today, and thank the audience for being here.